Our second presenter this afternoon is Brent Neely. His topic is Jonah, his life, death, and resuscitation. Brent.
Sorry, Brent.
Like you said, I'm Brent, and I will be talking about the prophet Jonah in the Old Testament. And I will just make a short and brief argument that he died while in the water, and while in the belly of the fish, that he was resuscitated. I use the word resuscitation to make clear that he was not resurrected, resurrection being the coming back in a glorified state, compared to he was just brought back to life. Now, Jonah is arguably one of the most interesting prophets in the entire Old Testament. He is, without a doubt, the most effective preacher in history. He said 8 words and converted an entire city. He was thrown overboard of a ship and he converted an entire group of sailors, all while having the worst attitude of any preacher. Unlike other prophetic books in the Old Testament, this one doesn't concentrate on Jonah's prophecy. It spends only about 8 words saying what he actually said. Yet 40 days and Nineveh will be destroyed. That's the only thing they mention of him saying. But rather instead they focus on his individual life, which is one of stubbornness, and not the good kind of stubbornness like I have. So I'm told. And I believe that the writer would rather show us a message by what he tells us about Jonah. Now, there have been some scholars that make the argument that Jonah is just a parable, that it's not historical, and that it was just a parable used to tell a good story, which might be the case. But even if that is, it is still based on a real person, as we see in 2 Kings 14:25, which talks about Jonah being from Gath-Hepher, which is in the northern region of Israel, also being the son of Amittai, and also living during the time of Jeroboam II. Now, the book of Jonah is one of my favorite books. It's one that I've translated. It's one that I've worked with. And it starts off with the prophet Jonah being called by God, "Arise, go to Nineveh, tell them of my glory." And instead, Jonah does just the opposite. He gets up and he goes down to Joppa. And from there, he gets on a ship to sail to Tarshish, which is one of the furthest places he can get. While on the ship, this horrible storm happens, and all the sailors are flipping out, not knowing what to do. They're drawing lots to try to figure out whose God is angry at us. And then the captain finds Jonah sleeping at the bottom of the ship. And so he's like, "Wake up, dude, what are you doing? Do you not see what's happening?" And so Jonah comes up and says, "This is my fault. You always ticked at me. Throw me overboard. It'll be done." So they do that. He ends up getting swallowed by a large fish. And then he prays a prayer of thanksgiving in the 2nd chapter. After this prayer of thanksgiving, he is then spit out onto dry land, and he goes to Nineveh. He says 8 words to them. They all repent, from the king down to the cows. And then he gets really ticked at this, and he sits outside the city walls, and he's moping like, "Dang it, God, I knew you wouldn't destroy him anyways. Why was I here?" And so it's a hot, deserty day, and sand's kicking, and so God creates this plant to shade Jonah. Jonah falls asleep, and then God destroys the plant. And Jonah, having the horrible attitude he does, is like, "What the heck, God? Why'd you destroy that plant?" And so God's like, "How much more do I care about the Ninevites and their cows than you do this plant?" And so, a little bit of background to the book. We have no idea who wrote it. It was unlikely that Jonah or anybody he was close with would have wrote it, because they made him out to be a jerk. And if one of my friends wrote a book about me, hopefully they would make me a little nicer than Jonah was made out to be. We do know that it was likely written between 500 and 250 BCE. This is mainly due because of the way that Nineveh was described. It was described as being a great city in the past, which Nineveh fell in 612 BCE. Along with that, we have the theme of God's caring for all his creation, which doesn't come around till later on in some of the later works. The purpose of the book is summed up by Douglas Stewart in probably the best description of any book. The purpose of this book is simply, don't be like Jonah. And so one of the major questions in regards to this book is the psalm that happens in chapter 2, verses 3 through 9. The question is, was this originally in the book? Was this originally part of the story? And if it was, why? It doesn't fit the rest of the theme of Jonah being this jerk that doesn't listen to God, even though he's God's prophet. And then all of a sudden he's singing a praise of thanksgiving. He's happy. He's praising God for what he has done. Then he gets kicked out of the whale, and he's back to being a jerk. And so some people think that it's out of place, and that it would have made more sense, if it was a psalm of lament. And so that portion, starting with the last verse of chapter 1, and the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the stomach of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. Then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the stomach of the fish, and he said, I called out in my distress to the Lord, and he answered me. I cried for help from the depth of Sheol. You heard my voice. For you had cast me into the deep, into the hearts of the seas, and the current engulfed me. All your breakers and billows passed over me. So I said, I have been expelled from your sight. Nevertheless, I will look again towards your holy temple. Water encompassed me to the point of death. The great deep engulfed me, and weeds were wrapped around my head. I descended to the roots of the mountain. The earth with its bars was around me forever. But you have brought up my life from the pit, O Lord my God. While I was fainting away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you, into your holy temple. Those who regard vain idols forsake their faithfulness, but I will sacrifice to you with the voice of thanksgiving. That which I have vowed, I will pay. Salvation is from the Lord. Then the Lord commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah up onto the dry land. And so, technically, this story flows fine without this chapter, or without this section. If you remove it, the story still flows. But it works in well, because I'm one of the people that I believe that this was a part of the original story. I do not think it was added in. Although I differ from others as to why they think that. There are some that are the more conservative that are like, well, this is how we have the Bible, this is just how it is. That's how it was. One of the reasons that I think this was a part of the original text is because the entire book of Jonah is one of the most well-crafted books I've seen. The entire book is made up of a chiasmus, meaning it goes from A, B, C, C, B, A, but it does this all the way down to J. And so it does A, B, C, D, E, all the way to J, and then back down to A. And not only does it do that throughout the entire book, each of the individual chapters also have their own individual chiasms. And not only that, some of the individual sections as well. And so it just seems unlikely that something that flows this perfectly and has this much structure would be an accident. And the psalm takes place while in the belly of the fish. And that's mainly what I want to focus on and how this fits with it being there. And so my argument is that Jonah literally died while in the water before being swallowed by the fish, and he was then resuscitated, which as far as I know, no scholars agree with me. I just think I've outsmarted them. And here's my reasoning for why I think this. One, it fits Jonah's personality. Jonah was a jerk who was called by God to do something, and Jonah was willing to do whatever it took to not do that. Jonah hated the Ninevites, which is understandable. The Ninevites like to kill people and then post them on sticks for everybody to see. I can understand why Jonah did not like them. But he was willing to go as far as it took to not do what he was supposed to. Jonah is constantly running away from God as far as he can, but God does not let him escape. Also, it's just poetic. Like, it is great poetry to have Jonah go literally as far away as he can to go down into the depth of Sheol and for God to pick him back up. When going through this, my question is, how much further can you go from God than being dead? You can't get further from God or from the Ninevites than when you're dead. And so it seems likely. Also, the text makes it seem like Jonah wanted to die. He tells the men, throw me overboard. Throw me into the water. I'd rather be dead than deal with the Ninevites. Because I think it's likely that Jonah could have just said, it's my fault, I messed up. I'm sorry, God. Hey guys, can you guys take me back to Joppa and I'll head up to Nineveh, and the storm would have ceased. Also, the theme of going down is throughout the entire first half of the book. Jonah goes down to Joppa. He goes down into the bottom of the ship. He goes down into the water. And then during his psalm, he goes down into the depth of Sheol. So to me, it only makes sense that going down to Sheol was his death. And hence, when he was resuscitated in the whale, or the fish, excuse me, when he was resuscitated in the fish, he's praising God. He's like, heck yeah, I'm back. And then he gets vomited out, and he's like, crud, got to do this mission again. And so, upon being spat back out, he returns to his jerkish way. And I can understand this because I resonate with that, where if God tells me to do something and I don't want to do it, I go as far as I can, and then God finally like, no, come on, back this way. And I'm like, oh, thanks God for saving me. Oh, dang it, I don't want to do this. And also, to bring the New Testament into this, Jesus in both Matthew's and Luke's gospel tells us that the only generation, or the only sign that this generation that he was in would receive would be that of Jonah. And some have made the argument that that just means 3 days and 3 nights and he'd come back. But for me, I feel like it makes so much more sense if death was involved. And lastly, and this is the big one, is the gender of the fish. In English, nothing jumps out to us when we read it. A big fish swallowed him, and a big fish did this, and a big fish did this, and finally the big fish spat him out. But in Hebrew, we lose something in translation. In the Hebrew, we see that it is a male fish, and then the next time it's also regarded as a male fish. The third time it's referred to as a female fish, and then the last time, when he spits him out, it's back to being a male fish. And some have argued that, oh, this is just a typo. Again, to me, that doesn't make sense with how well crafted this book is, as well as the fact that it mentions the fish just 2 lines before it. So it seems unlikely for it to be a typo. And so the fish was male when he was in the water. The fish was male when he swallowed Jonah. But then right before Jonah prays his prayer, right before he comes back to life, all of a sudden the fish is female. And then being spat out, the fish is back to male. And my argument for this is that the author is trying to show that Jonah's life was given back to him in the fish. That the fish literally became pregnant, if you will, with Jonah's life. And so the fish didn't magically change from being a male fish to a female fish, but rather the author is just trying to show us life was conceived in this fish when Jonah was brought back to life. And so it is for these reasons that I argue that Jonah lived, that he died, and that he was also brought back to life. That God had a assigned task for him, and that God wasn't going to let him get away from that. And so Jonah was brought back to life, and he finished what he was supposed to do, even if he was still a jerk about it. Thank you.
Oh, surely there's some questions.
Brent, to this last point about the gender of the fish,
Yeah.
I'm no Hebrew scholar, so can you help me understand how close the words for male fish and female fish
Yeah,
are?
they're fairly close. They're only 1 letter difference. The vowel pointings are a little different too, but those were added in later on. So it's basically if the male fish was GD and then the female fish was GDH, is basically how one could look at it. So they are closely related, but just with how well the book is put together, it seems like that would be way too much of an obvious typo for it to be a typo.
I don't know if you have this in front of you, but you said the form of Jonah goes A, B, C, all the way to J. Where does that psalm fit in that form?
I don't have it in front of me. If you want, I wrote a paper on it for Dr. LaFountain, and it lists out a bunch of the chiasmas. I believe this one would have been closer to the center, more towards like, this is the turning point where Jonah's at his highest, and then he goes back to being Jonah.
I know you were speaking in the vernacular, but I think I heard you say that Jonah was siphoned, he was resuscitated, yippee, but now, dang, I gotta be spit out. What kind of a life would he have lived in a fish? Is that any kind of a life to get excited about?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it would be, but I know with me personally, I've had a few near-death experiences, which may or may not have been my own fault. But on that point of getting back to living, I was excited, even if I was in the hospital hooked up to tubes. So it was like, yes, thanks God. I understand that was my own fault, but I'm glad you saved me. And then I went back to being a jerk. So I can resonate with Jonah.
Any other comments or questions? Thanks. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Interesting idea. I want to think about it. That's why we have these talks. I don't know whether you were saying this yourself or quoting other people that, oh, Jonah is just a parable. And if you're quoting this, well, whoever you're quoting, why the word just a parable?
I myself don't think it's a parable. I think it is a historical event. At least I hope so. I think it'd be cool if it was. But there are scholars out there that think it is a parable. And for me, I think it takes a bit away from it if it's just a parable. It's a good story, but I think it speaks more to me personally if it's a true story. And so saying just a parable is probably just a misspeak on my part, probably a like Freudian slip of what I think, but yeah.
I'm going to betray my ignorance, and I shouldn't do that, but I do it all the time. If the Ninevites were, I'll use the vernacular, saved, repented, what happened to them? That's the capital of Assyria, right? They're eventually, so what happened? Did they backslide, or?
I'm figuring they might have just pulled a Jonah, where they got all excited about God and what he was doing, and then they kind of lost track of him, and instead of doing what they were supposed to, they went back to doing their own thing.
Okay, thank you.